Good afternoon. My name is Patricia O'Reilly. On behalf of the Jesuits of Canada and our Communications Director, Jose Sanchez, I welcome you to our presentation by Father Peter Bisson, Personal and Institutional Conversion, the Jesuits of Canada and Indigenous Peoples. Father Bisson will speak for approximately 40 minutes, followed by questions and answers. Please post your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom or top of your screen. I'll turn it over to Jose to give some details about translation.
Thank you, Pat. And for this bit, I will switch to French so that our francophone audience can choose a language that they prefer. Alors, pour choisir la langue de votre préférence, si vous êtes sur un ordinateur, dans les commandes de votre session, cliquez sur le bouton Interprétation et après, cliquez sur la langue que vous souhaitez entendre. Si vous êtes sur un appareil mobile, dans les contrôles de votre session, appuyez sur le bouton avec les trois petits points au plus et après, appuyez sur Interprétation de la langue et finalement, appuyez sur la langue que vous souhaitez entendre. I'm also posting these instructions in the chat for your reference. And then the last thing, as Pat said, please enter your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat box. We might not get to them if you enter them in the chat box. And that's it. Thank you, Pat.
We'll begin with the land acknowledgement. We begin by acknowledging the Indigenous people of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, let us take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. While we do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous people and their cultures. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and commit each in our own way to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. We quote Pope Francis speaking directly to Canadian Indigenous leaders. I also feel shame, sorrow, and shame for the role that a number of Catholics, particularly those with educational responsibilities, the role they have had in all these things that wounded you and the abuses you suffered, and the lack of respect shown for your identity, your culture, and even your spiritual values. For the deplorable conduct of these members of the Catholic Church, I ask for God's forgiveness, and I want to say to you with all my heart, I am very sorry. And I join my brothers and Canadian bishops in asking your pardon. It's my pleasure to introduce Father Bisson. He is a member of the Society of Jesus based in Ottawa, Ontario, and he currently serves as the assistant to the Jesuit Provincial for Justice, Ecology, and Indigenous Relations. He animates and supports the justice work of the Jesuits in Canada with a special emphasis on reconciliation and right relations with Indigenous peoples. Father Bisson has served as the Provincial Superior of the Jesuits in English Canada. Father Bisson, thank you for being with us this afternoon. Over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really honored to be able to share some of my experiences and insights with you. And I'd like to thank also the organizers who helped put this together. It's been a couple of years in the preparation, and in the last few weeks, I think I've been quite busy for the organizers. So thank you to the organizers for this opportunity and for bringing everyone together. So I'd like to share with you how the Jesuits have been transformed by Ignatian Spirituality and our work in reconciliation. So I call my talk, this is what I call my talk, Stopped by a Cannonball, an Ignatian Experience of Reconciliation, of Transformation. Stopped by Cannonball, an Ignatian Experience of Transformation. St. Ignatius of Loyola, who founded the Jesuits, was a bold soldier and an aspiring minor noble. In 1521, in a battle near Pamplona in what is now Spain, a cannonball put a sudden end to that career. During his long and painful convalescence, an interior transformation began in him that led to many other changes in himself and in others. Among these changes are the spiritual exercises upon which Ignatian spirituality is based, and the religious order known as the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, of which I am a member. I'd like to share with you now some stories of how Indigenous people have been a similar cannonball for the Jesuits in Canada, and how Ignatian spirituality has guided us through the major transformation that it has caused. My personal story of reconciliation with survivors of Indian residential schools started on my very first day as provincial. That is, when I began my role as a religious leader for the Jesuits in the English-speaking parts of Canada. It was May 31st, 2012, the first day of a public event in Toronto run by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or TRC. I went. I had been alerted that the official Catholic Church would be sparsely represented at this gathering, so it would be important that I attend, especially as Jesuit provincial. I'd also been advised that it would be helpful if I were clearly identifiable as a priest, and so I should wear clerical garb to show that the church was interested, concerned, and in solidarity with survivors. So I did. Wore a clerical shirt with a Roman collar and a gray suit. When I arrived at the gathering venue in downtown Toronto, dressed as a priest, I quickly realized that I had made a terrible mistake. Instead of being a symbol of peace, communion, and solidarity, I began to wonder if I was a trigger for traumatic memories of physical and sexual abuse, of loss of culture, language, territory, and spirituality. I could see Indigenous people looking at me sideways, flinching, hesitating. I wondered to myself, did I symbolize residential schools and the larger, dark connections between evangelization and colonization? I tried to dress down by taking off my jacket, rolling up my sleeves, and taking out the tab from my Roman collar, but it was still obvious that I was a priest. While no one was rude to me, Indigenous people still seemed uncomfortable. Inside myself, I felt shame and vulnerability. I wanted to hide by seeking out the company of other church people. I resisted this desire with only modest success and tried to mix with survivors and other attendees, but I felt like an outsider. I was the other, and a visible other too. My situation got worse. At the end of the gathering, there was a banquet. I went in, found a table with some people and a few empty chairs, and sat down. I was the only non-Indigenous person at the table. I made small talk and received polite, brief replies. There was also a lot of silence. I noticed that the master of ceremonies was giving me dirty looks. After about 15 or 20 minutes, I noticed a small sign in the middle of the table that read, "Reserved for survivors." I was in the wrong place. By that time, I felt too confused and self-conscious to draw further attention to myself by saying sorry and asking if I should move elsewhere. It also felt too late for that, so I stayed and squirmed. I suppose that my shame was far less than the pain that survivors had experienced as children and young people, and far from the lingering harms that they, their families, and communities continue to suffer today. I also realized it was important that as a church person, I experienced the guilt, shame, grief, and responsibility for the pain that we as an institution had helped to cause, and that I not run away from these feelings and their meaning. Guilt, shame, grief, and responsibility were important parts of the truth I needed to feel, not only as information and ideas in my head, but also as emotions and values in my heart and in my body. This was especially challenging to me as a church person, because I like to see myself as nice, kind, generous, good, and I like others to perceive me that way. I like to be needed and helpful and to receive gratitude for this. It was hard to feel uncomfortable for being what I thought God had called me to be. But my heart needed to sink lower still. Over the course of the gathering, I noticed that while many felt uncomfortable around me, no one was rude or insulting or even condescending. Indeed, many were polite and respectful, and some even tried to make me feel welcome. Here I was, a symbol of traumatic memories and oppression, and I was being made welcome by at least some survivors of that same oppression. This melted my heart. So both vulnerability and hospitality marked the beginnings of my experience of religious leadership and of reconciliation. Another aspect of my personal transformation came from ongoing contact with the TRC commissioners, both formally in meetings with representatives of the parties to the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, or IRSSA, and informally outside of these meetings. While the commissioners were occasionally firm and critical of the church representatives, they were always courteous and respectful. Over time, I came to realize that they never treated us as though we were defendants in an adversarial process, which I would have understood. Instead, they treated us like potential partners in the long-term work of reconciliation and healing between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. Similarly, in Indigenous parishes on Manitoulin Island and the North Shore of Lake Huron and in Thunder Bay, despite the pain and damage that we Jesuits had helped to cause, Indigenous Catholics did not ask us to leave. On the Jesuit side, despite the humiliation of well-founded accusations and the painful realization that in many ways we'd been a fundamental part of their problems, we stuck around too. My willingness to enter experiences of shame and vulnerability in the context of reconciliation had its roots in an older Jesuit story. The first hints of allegations of abuse in the residential school that we ran in Spanish Ontario appeared in 1988 during preparations for the first reunion of former students of the Spanish residential schools. But the older alumni persuaded the younger ones to be quiet and to respect the priests. They did, yet the reunion was tense. Within 3 to 4 years, the first formal allegations of sexual abuse appeared. More came from our Indigenous parishes than from the school, but allegations came from both. We did not want to believe the claims. Our refusal to listen led, reasonably, to lawsuits. We reacted defensively and used the law and legal process as weapons. We were angry. We put our own financial and reputational interests before those of the victims and did not really listen to what they had to say. We were judging them negatively in order to defend our view of ourselves and our Jesuit history, and probably also to defend what we saw as our position of dominance. After a while, however, we began to realize that we were treating old friends like they were enemies. Because of this realization, we started listening attentively to the stories of the survivors and designating certain Jesuits to be the listeners, and eventually non-Jesuit professionals in order to be more objective. Noticing consistent patterns in the stories, we started to investigate the reports and found disturbing truths that confirmed many of the allegations. Admitting the truths led us to admit responsibility for the harmful actions of our brothers and to seek to heal the damage if the victims wished. The transition to putting the victims first and Jesuit interests second took time and was not always smooth. Furthermore, admitting guilt and responsibility was a risk because it could have invited more lawsuits, and the payments we had already made had put our Canadian Jesuit group in financial distress. The greater risk, however, involved changing our attitude toward ourselves and our past. The humiliation and the risk of apology were the narrow door that we had to pass through in order to continue our relationships with the Anishinaabe people and communities that we had known for generations. Perhaps unexpectedly, admitting guilt and taking responsibility did not lead to more lawsuits, but instead led slowly to deeper and new relations relationships that were more of partnership and friendship than of superiority and inferiority, than of helper and receiver. Eventually, we also worked up the courage and humility to say that we had participated in cultural genocide. In 2013, at the TRC's national event in Montreal, the Jesuits publicly read out our apology and statement of reconciliation. It was delivered by Father Winston Rye, who was at the time part of the Jesuits leadership team for English Canada, and who was himself a Métis from Winnipeg. He helped draft the statement. He became emotional as he read it. Afterward, he deposited it in the Commission's bentwood box reserved for artifacts of reconciliation. Then in 2014, there was a gathering of Jesuits, Anishinaabe people, and others involved in Jesuit Indigenous ministries. Participants came from Regina, Thunder Bay, Manitoulin Island, and the North Shore of Lake Huron, Sudbury, Toronto, and Ottawa. We met for a few days in Wesleyan Dominican, the Anishinaabe Spiritual Center. The sessions were shared by a Jesuit priest and a Catholic Indigenous elder. As the days unfolded, the sessions turned into something like mutual confession. The Anishinaabe people shared their pain and frustrations from the legacy of residential schools, colonialism, and from being patronized. And the Jesuits shared their struggles with the stress of being the bad white colonizer, guilt, shame, overwork, loneliness, and alcohol. Then an elder said something like, "Yes, that's all true. But I can see in the dark, and I see Jesus there too." I gasped interiorly when I heard this, for it was a repeat of my first days as provincial, but in a stronger way. We were welcomed by one who knew our guilt and responsibility, even if that welcome included a challenge and an invitation to a new attitude of partnership. The experience of mutual confession of pain and frustration was cathartic. It bound us together and moved us forward. When the Jesuits left the gathering, we felt that we were no longer serving the Anishinaabe people, but that we were being helped by them, and that we were becoming partners in building the common good and the reign of God. While only a small number of people had this experience, it was nevertheless a pivotal one. This Indigenous Ministries meeting of 2014 paved the way for a similarly transformative meeting the following summer, one that was much broader in scope. Jesuits and colleagues from all our ministries across the country who had leadership responsibilities gathered for a communal apostolic discernment exercise to interpret how the Spirit of God was calling us to prioritize our collective energies. Using a spiritual method that we call spiritual conversation, which is very similar to Indigenous sharing circles, we listened to each other carefully, trying to feel in our exchanges how God was at work among us as we expressed our memories, hopes, desires, fears, and anxieties about the world, about our work, about ourselves, and about how we work together. The first priority that emerged from this exercise was to promote spirituality, especially by using the spiritual exercise of St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. This was not a surprise. The second priority to emerge, however, was a surprise. It was Indigenous relations. We did not mean Indigenous ministry, which already existed. Indigenous ministry meant pastoral work in Anishinaabe parishes and training Indigenous women and men for leadership roles in the church. Indigenous relations included these activities, but meant something bigger. It meant that all our ministries should cultivate relations with Indigenous people and communities, learn what Canada looks like from Indigenous perspectives, and grasp what it means to be partners and friends. In short, it meant making Indigenous relations part of how we do things in Canada. Cultivating respectful Indigenous relations was no longer the responsibility of one sector of our ministries, but had become the interest and responsibility of all. This change flowed from an insight that emerged from a prayerful yet critical examination of the history of the Jesuits in Canada. That we are most ourselves, we are most Jesuit when we are in right relations with Indigenous people. At the end of this exercise, an elder announced, "Now I feel like a friend, an equal, a partner. Finally, I feel recognized. And this observation came after almost 40 years of working together. In other words, she had felt patronized by us for that long. This new commitment was a significant change in Jesuit attitudes and priorities, which at first provoked some controversy among us. Some Jesuits did not want to face the reality that some of us had sexually abused children in our care. Some reacted against the claim that we had participated in cultural genocide, even if unwittingly. Some objected to the idea of taking a more critical view of aspects of our missionary past. In the years since then, the new commitment and humility it requires have settled and seem to be confirmed as more and more Jesuit ministries develop connections with Indigenous people and organizations. Indeed, just a few weeks ago, a colleague commented to me that concern for right relations with Indigenous people now seems to be a shared concern across most of our ministries. An important feature of this new commitment was that it was arrived at collectively. It was not simply driven by a leader who would be replaced in 3 years' time. While it was part of my role as provincial to express the commitment in concrete decisions and actions, I did have a broad base of support for doing so and could invoke the communal discernment exercise as a spiritual authority for following up on the commitment. We still have much progress to make in implementing it, but we have begun. I've shared some of the events that have pushed and prodded the Jesuits forward on paths of reconciliation and, hopefully, of decolonization. Now I'd like to say a word about what has supported us along the way. The journey of transformation would not have been possible without scholarly research and the archive of the Jesuits in Canada in Montreal. Much that we learned from our records was not comforting, but we shared them with the TRC anyway, for the sake of preserving and healing the memories of residential schools and of colonization. As the TRC maintained and our experience has confirmed, there can be no reconciliation without learning the truth, even if it makes us miserable for a time. Even more important for support through this journey has been ongoing relationships through thick and thin, in ordinary life and in conflict, ongoing relationships with Anishinaabe communities and people on Manitoulin Island, along the north shore of Lake Huron and in the region of Thunder Bay. Listening to persons has helped us to hear the truth and to be affected by it. Staying in relationship despite the conflict and being allowed to stay in relationship has helped us to bear our truth in a safe space. It is through relations that the Jesuits are being healed and maybe even decolonized, along with a good intellectual and reflective kick from the TRC. Now I'd like to step back from storytelling and highlight our transformation itself. What were we changed from? And what are we being changed to? Now these changes apply first to me, then to the Jesuits and our partners in ministry. Before the cannonball struck, we had a naive and uncritical view of ourselves and of our relationships with Indigenous peoples. We were proud of our missionary past and saw ourselves, as did many others, as having played important roles in setting up the church in Canada and in building the country. We saw ourselves as kind, generous people with a lot to offer. We saw ourselves as educators and empowerers of an underprivileged group. Our attitude towards ourselves was naive because there was little critical awareness. The policies of our ancestors and governments caused Indigenous people to suffer. There was therefore no critical self-awareness of a need to apologize, whether for residential schools or for colonization and its impacts. Nor was there self-critical awareness of the difference in power between Indigenous people and us as settlers. Unsettling this naive position and making it not only self-aware, but also self-critical, took energy and education. When Anishinaabe people first approached us with complaints, they did so by means of informal interpersonal processes of reconciliation. These failed in getting us to listen seriously because our naive self-perception got in the way. Instead, it took the very formal processes of litigation to get our attention and to make us question ourselves. A good example of a colonizing attitude is well described by historian David Shanahan in his study of the Spanish residential school, when he observes about us Jesuits. It is an unfortunate habit of people trying to do the right thing for others that they often fail to ask of those who they seek to help exactly what is the right thing to do. With a certain arrogance, the missionaries always seem to assume that they knew what was right, what was the right thing to do. More importantly, they seem to assume that the people agreed with them. The Jesuits came with a package deal for the Wikwemikong people: salvation, education, civilization, etc. End of quote. I once heard Dr. Marie Wilson, the TRC commissioner in charge of liaison with the Christian churches, and herself a Christian, say a similar thing, that church people seem to have a harder time with reconciliation than others. The attitude described by Shanahan is fundamental to maintaining a power differential between colonizer and colonized, because the attitude masks the power difference from the colonizers themselves. Our surprise and shock at the lack of gratitude or even resistance with which these acts of service were met was a sign of a lack of critical self-awareness. I would further specify the problematic unself-critical church attitude as being based in our view of ourselves as benevolent and spiritually nonviolent. Being accused of spiritual violence challenges not only our actions, but also our spiritual identity, as it means being untrue to our foundational inspiration, Jesus Christ and his example. TRC itself discusses spiritual violence. It happens when one is not allowed to follow one's preferred spiritual tradition, or when a different religious or spiritual path is forced on one, or when one's spiritual or religious traditions, beliefs, or practices are demeaned or belittled, or when one is made to feel ashamed of practicing their traditional or family beliefs. When our naive, unself-critical attitude was first challenged, our attitude fought back. Under the pressure of criticism, accusations, and finally litigation, naive self-awareness was challenged, shaken, and exposed. This was the true starting point for processes of reconciliation. The accusations and the challenge to naivete were resisted with anger and indignation, the beginnings of a troubled and unsettled conscience. After all, Christian leaders have seen ourselves as moral and spiritual guides, teachers, and judges for over 4 centuries on Turtle Island. It is shocking to have the roles suddenly reversed and to be on the receiving end of moral and spiritual guidance, teaching, and even challenge. In the 1970s and 1980s in Canada, the churches had come to see ourselves as social justice allies of Indigenous peoples. Until then, the mainline Christian churches and the government of Canada shared similar attitudes towards Indigenous people. What happened to make the churches switch sides? In the Catholic Church in the 1960s, a reforming spirit was nurtured by the Second Vatican Council. This 4-year gathering of all the Catholic bishops of the world greatly opened up the church's attitude towards the modern world, updating everything from ritual to acknowledging social justice as a fundamental part of living out Christian faith. At the same time, the post-war period around the world saw movements for decolonization, liberation, and human rights. In this international atmosphere, the Christian churches in Canada in the 1970s and 1980s frequently sided with Indigenous peoples against the federal government on social justice issues, especially about natural resources. For example, the James Bay hydroelectric project in Quebec and the Mackenzie Valley pipeline issue in the Northwest Territories. In the early 1990s, Indigenous challenges about residential schools marginalized these newfound alliances, which changed the relationship with the churches and caught us by surprise. At the same time, starting in the 1960s, and gaining momentum in the 70s and 80s, Indigenous people in Canada were starting to assert themselves in new ways that many scholars in Canada now call Indigenous Resurgence. So, Indigenous Resurgence and the residential school issue were the cannonball that stopped us dead in our tracks. What it stopped was the progress of our naive and uncritical view of ourselves as innocent and spiritually nonviolent helpers and allies of Indigenous people. Now, what are we becoming on the other side of the cannonball? In recent years, and especially since the 2015 commitment and our contact with the TRC, the influence of Indigenous people on the Jesuits in Canada has grown in extent and depth. Here are some examples. Jesuit relations in the urban Indigenous neighborhoods of Regina, Saskatchewan, and Winnipeg in Manitoba have grown through our support of two middle schools there. They are Mother Teresa Middle School in Regina and Gonzaga Middle School in Winnipeg. Both schools give a lot of attention to each pupil and to their families and teach Indigenous cultural and spiritual traditions. The schools are also committed to supporting their pupils after graduation through secondary and post-secondary education until full-time employment. The Jesuits do not run these schools, but we help to start them, and the schools participate fully in the networks of Jesuit schools in Canada and the US and around the world, which enables them to share in these networks resources for curriculum development, pedagogy, and leadership training, among others, and to contribute to these networks too. In 2016, we began to entrust part of the training of young Jesuits to the teaching and guidance of Indigenous elders in summer experiences of 6 to 8 weeks. As this training gets repeated with new Jesuits over the years, we hope that more and more Jesuits in Canada will have had some experience of Indigenous life as interpreted by Indigenous people, so that this may in turn shape our perspectives on Canada, on the Church, and on Christian faith. The Jesuits have recently joined 3 groups of Indigenous and non-Indigenous Christians working together. Firstly, in direct response to the TRC's calls to action, some Indigenous and non-Indigenous Catholic leaders worked with the leadership of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops to launch in 2016 the Our Lady of Guadalupe Circle. It is dedicated to improving relations between Indigenous peoples and the Catholic Church, as well as between Indigenous and Catholic spiritualities. Secondly, in 2018, the request of Stan McKay, former moderator of the United Church of Canada and himself an Indigenous man, several representatives from various Christian backgrounds, including the Jesuits, began to explore how to decolonize the practice of Christian faith. Thirdly, Jesuits in Ottawa have been involved in Cattery Native Ministry there, which I do too. Cattery Native Ministry is an Indigenous and lay-led Catholic ministry of healing, reconciliation, and education. Finally, the current Provincial of Canada, Eric Oland, has assigned me to work on promoting our 2015 commitment, that is, promoting decolonization among Jesuits in a more systematic way by encouraging our ministries to develop relations with Indigenous people, communities, and organizations. Now, to conclude, I've described different developments in reconciliation, some of which have been quite challenging. What made the processes of reconciliation move forward for us? The fuel that has driven the whole process ahead, especially the passage into real listening and a reconciliation that moves beyond apologies to transformed relationships, has been ongoing relationships with Indigenous people and Ignatian spirituality. Indigenous resurgence, together with relationships, have been challenging settlers to act like honest peers and partners. It was resurgent Indigenous people who first challenged the Jesuits to listen by suing us. They were and still are the ones who call us to respectful relations. They are also the ones who call us to go beyond apology and restitution for past concrete wrongs to the building of right relations for a shared future. Since decolonization and right relations with Indigenous peoples involve so many of the patterns of structural injustice in Canada, right relations with Indigenous people will be good for all of Canada. Ignatian spirituality has also been an important part of the fuel that has moved us forward. I'd like to touch on 3 characteristics that especially helped us, one general, and the other 2 that are part of recent adaptations of Ignatian spirituality. A distinctive characteristic of Ignatian spirituality is discerned reflection on and active involvement in the qualities of one's own engagement with God in the world and in oneself. I'll say that again. A discerned reflection on and active involvement in the qualities of one's own engagement with God, God acting in the world and in oneself. Along with this is a strong presupposition that God is good and in love with us, and that therefore the world is fundamentally good despite our many problems. These 2 qualities gave us the courage and the humility really to listen to Indigenous people once we got over our temper tantrum, and to face whatever the bad things were in our history. Painful and even terrifying as this was, we had a basic trust that facing the truth would lead us to something new and good, even if we did not know what that was. As someone once said, the truth will set you free, but first it will make you miserable. This is true. And the misery is worth what happens on the other side. The freedom on the other side is freedom from a naive, uncritical, and inflated self-perception. But even more than the freedom from something is the freedom that comes with new and better relations. Now we have many more friendships and partnerships with Indigenous people than we had before. We are learning from them too. We are learning to listen better with less judgment and less self-defense. We are also coming to recognize more and more that if we are to seek the kind of integral ecological conversion that Pope Francis seeks, and if we are to integrate our relationship with creation into our relationships with each other and with God, then we need the help of Indigenous wisdoms and spiritualities and their ways of relating with creation and with Creator. Another aspect of Ignatian spirituality that helped us was a recent development that extended Ignatian spirituality from personal transformation to social transformation. In the mid-1970s, the Society of Jesus around the world made a collective discernment and decision to work for social justice was an absolute requirement of faith. The Jesuits were not the only religious group to come to this kind of commitment. This decision basically socialized religious faith. Our new religious commitment to social justice was the foundation for our desires in Canada to be partners with Indigenous people and to pay the price of losing our naive view of ourselves, of our history, and of our privilege. The socialization of our faith in social justice also affected our practice of discernment, something that is normally seen as very personal and interior. While discernment is not a uniquely Ignatian characteristic in Christian spirituality, it is a spiritual gift that is especially cultivated in Ignatian spirituality. Partly because of the experience of our new comprehensive religious commitment to social justice, we have also socialized discernment in a practice called communal discernment or discernment in common, which has been especially developed in Canada. Indeed, the key event that helped us move from fear of criticism and preoccupation with concrete offenses and apologies to transformed relationships was our communal experience of discernment in 2015. Indeed, I believe that while the residential school issue and Indigenous Resurgence were our cannonball moment, the communal discernment experience of 2015 was our mountaintop moment. Mountaintop where Jesus was transfigured. The mountaintop moment could not have happened if we had not been stopped and opened up by the cannonball moment, so that the 2 moments together were essential to our transformation. In the same way as in the spiritual exercises, without week 1, where we face our own sinfulness in the context of God's mercy and love, without week 1, there can be no passage to following Jesus on his mission in active mission. Because we experience this change to Indigenous relations as a call from God, we gain the trust to face our shadow side and the confidence to allow ourselves not only to be affected, but also to be changed. Furthermore, this call was a shared experience. It was not the religious experience of one leader who then had to convince others, but a shared experience, which happened by listening carefully and spiritually to each other and to our history. We discovered, to our surprise, that Indigenous people had been an integral part of our story all along and should now become partners in telling and shaping of perhaps our parallel stories going forward into a shared future. Thank you for your kind attention. And now I'd be very happy to take your questions and comments.
Hello, Father. I would like to ask you a few questions. In your opinion, what is the role of the community, here the Jesuits, in your personal conversion? Does the importance of the community offer you a total conversion of your life? What is the imprint of God in the community where you are settled?
I tried to touch on that a little bit at the end of my talk, when I talked about the exercises and the cannonball moment and the mountaintop moment. That's when I tried to put the experience, the stories that I told. So I tried to put those in the framework of the spiritual exercises. But my own conversion, it began as part of my vocation process before being drawn to the Society of Jesus. And it really involved, I was a religious young man, religious boy. I come from a religious family, a religious culture, really, French-Canadian culture in northwestern New Brunswick. It was when I grew up. But what was my conversion was really a personal encounter with Jesus, not simply intellectual belief or being a member of the church, which I felt was important, but really a personal encounter with Jesus and looking at my life, the good and the bad, in light of his love for me. And that made me want to share that, something like that experience, that freedom, that love with others. And then as a novice, it was discovering the resurrection in the spiritual exercises. I was really, really, really surprised by that. I believed in the resurrection before that, but to experience meeting the risen Lord and his joy was, it turned me upside down. And I realized, when that happened to me, I realized that my own spirituality had stopped at the crucifixion. And so I tended to look at the world, not exactly from a negative point of view, but something like that, maybe the point of view of penance, instead of joy. Now, joy doesn't take away the evil in the world, but it does give you the freedom to respond to the evil in a way that, in a loving way, and from freedom. There's more to my conversion than that, but I would say those are some of the big lines. And then in my more recent encounters with Indigenous people and growing friendships there, I'm becoming more and more aware of my own power and privilege. I come from a working class family. We didn't have much when I was growing up, so I'm not used to thinking of myself as privileged, but I'm white, I'm a man, I'm a settler, I'm a priest, I'm a Jesuit, I'm really well educated, I've got lots of contacts, so I have a lot of privilege and a lot of power. And furthermore, I don't have to put up with people yelling racial insults at me on the street. When I go into a store, the staff don't follow me around looking at my pockets to see if I've shoplifted something. And when I go to the hospital, no one asks me if I'm drunk. So I've become much more aware of the kind of privilege that I have, and much of the power that I have is not fair, but I do have it, and I can use it to empower others. So that's a more recent part of my conversion. And how does my community here in Ottawa help me? Well, most of the members of my community come from Africa and have experienced colonization in one way or another themselves. So this is a frequent part of our conversation in the house here. Thank you for that question.
Father, a very moving presentation. Thank you. Let's pretend we could remove history. If you were a Jesuit arriving in Canada today, what would an informed approach to ministry here look like? What would you do? What would you not do?
Well, I don't know if the person means ministry with Indigenous people or ministry in general. I suppose the person means in general. Might have to think about that. Listen. Well, first of all, we would have been sent to Canada for some reason. So that would be part of what I'd be looking at. You know what? I'd listen to people's experience and try to, with others, in other words, listen with others and try to interpret how the Spirit of God is at work. Vatican II, that really reformed the church in the 1960s, developed this idea of the signs of the times. So the signs of the times are these kind of large social, cultural, political, economic phenomena that are indications of what God is up to in the world. And these indications are how people are cooperating with the Spirit and how people are resisting the Spirit. So reading those movements then, trying to discern them, and it's better done together. I can't do it well by myself. And especially when there are different points of view involved in that kind of discernment or reading. Responding to those signs of the times, I think, would have to guide our response or our actions and our decisions about what to do, what kind of ministry to engage in, and what not to engage in. And hopefully would do it together with others. And those others don't have to be Christian either. People of goodwill who are interested in promoting the good together. I hope that's a response to the question somewhat.
Father Peter, I live near and work closely with the Martyrs Shrine in Midland as part of the local Catholic school board. How can we find a way to tell the story of the Jesuit martyrs in an authentic but less triumphalistic and more dialogical way?
That's a big challenge. The provincial before me, Jim Webb, once said that Indigenous people have to feel comfortable at the shrine. In other words, the shrine will be doing its job when Indigenous people feel comfortable there, with the way the stories are being told of the Jesuit martyrs, of their Huron companions, and of the other Indigenous people that they were in contact with. So once Indigenous people feel comfortable there, then the shrine will be doing its job. It is so. What the person asks there is part of our own decolonization and part of the decolonization of our story. When I alluded to that in my talk, when I alluded to the Jesuits being connected with nation building, and we have been, along with many others in the church, but nation building has also been connected with nation destroying, and in other words, the damaging of Indigenous nations as we built up Canada. So we have to, we can't revise, we can't retell the story by ourselves. We have to work with Indigenous people and other people who have been harmed by the way the country and the church has been built up. We have to retell the story or rediscover those stories together with them. Now, that doesn't mean that they were the Jesuit martyrs weren't saints, but we don't require saints to be perfect either. Lots of saints go through history. Lots of saints made mistakes, and the saints themselves acknowledged that they made mistakes. So we canonize people not because they were perfect, but because they allowed the Spirit of God to work through them and with them. But that's a big challenge to go through our story, including the story of the Jesuit martyrs, in detail, to tell a fuller story that doesn't further colonize.
The second part of that question, how can we bring Indigenous voices into the conversation with our Catholic telling of that story in our school?
In the school, well, there are Indigenous people already connected to the shrine. People, I mean, there are Indigenous people who work at St. Marie among the Hurons, for example, across the road, and some of them are connected with Beausoleil First Nation on Christian Island, and Indigenous people on Manitoulin Island, who also know the shrine and who go to the shrine every year. I would start with them. And of course, the Native Friendship Centers in the region there.
All over media, since Pope Francis apologized, this idea floating around is presented. Please take some measures to combat wrong news. I am very uncomfortable to share your answer with my friends who I invited to watch your presentation.
So this was a question I responded. There was a previous question to that in the question and answer thing on the side here on the screen, and I replied to it quite briefly, and then I asked the person to come back with the second question. The basic idea was that only baptized people were human. As far as I know, there's no official church document that actually said that. But basically, from the time of the wars in Europe against the Muslims, ideas like this started to develop. You know, that if a land was not ruled by a Christian prince or king or queen, that then Christians had the right to take those lands. So that doesn't quite say that they're not human beings, but it does kind of suggest that. So what the person is getting at is what's called the Doctrine of Discovery. And this was 3 papal documents. They were called papal bulls that kind of set up this idea. And one of the main ones was called Inter Cetera, among other things, is what it translates as, of 1493, where the Pope of the day basically divided the world between Spain and Portugal. So who could colonize what part of the world? So that basically put most of the Americas under Spain, and Brazil went to Portugal. Then in subsequent decades, other popes condemned a lot of the practices of enslavement and abuse of Indigenous people and African slaves. And in Spain, which was one of the intellectual centers of the church at the time, there was a big debate in the first decades of the 16th century about whether or not Indigenous people had souls. And the Francisco de Vitoria was one of the main debaters, a scholar of the time. And the conclusion was, yes, they did. Yes, they did. They're human beings, whether they're baptized or not. They're human beings, and therefore, by virtue of the fact of being human beings, they have rights, including property rights. So when the Pope started criticizing the abuses, the conquerors, the popes would invoke that kind of an idea, maybe not explicitly, but certainly implicitly. But the Doctrine of Discovery, I suspect the European powers would have tried to conquer the Americas in any case, but the Doctrine of Discovery certainly gave them intellectual and spiritual justification for rationalization for doing that. And it's still, it sounds like something from 400, 500 years ago, but it's still actual today. The Supreme Court of the United States actually cited the Doctrine of Discovery in the early 19th century in an important decision about Indigenous land rights, I think it was. And I think it's behind, ideas like the sovereignty of the Crown in Canada, for example. So the idea and its consequences are woven into our laws about property and sovereignty, and who owns the land.
Thank you very much, Father. This was a welcome and necessary talk for me to hear. You have spoken about the Jesuits' transformation in relation to the Indigenous communities, but most of the Catholic orders that were involved in Indian residential schools were oblates. Are you able to inform us as to whether the oblates have done the same work as the Jesuits on this issue?
At the end of May, I and a colleague, Laurence Rouvière, who works in your same office as you, Patricia, will be facilitating a large gathering of the oblates in Edmonton. And one of the main topics is reconciliation. So yes, the oblates had a very large number of residential schools, and they are, I think, they are trying to go through a similar transformation that the Jesuits have been going through. Now, like everybody else, they've struggled a lot with this, with lots of ups and downs, but they came out with the first apology about residential schools in the early 1990s. Yeah, so that was an important moment, at least for the Oblates. The United Church came out with a previous apology, but it was more general, I think, more directed towards colonization in general. Now I think that apology was controversial among the Oblates, but I think that's settling now.
In the midst of exposing the truth that will set us free, even if it makes us miserable first, how do we avoid a simple scapegoating of those who worked in church-run residential schools, often in very trying situations, and work towards a broader acknowledgement of our common need to become part of the solution?
I think that's part of the lesson the Church in Canada is in the process of learning. And I see the bishop's apology that they made a few months ago as a sign of that. So let me explain. When so the Catholic participation in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement was not the participation of the whole church in Canada. It was only the religious orders and dioceses that had residential schools, most of them. So that you could see that, I'm going out on a limb here, you could see that as a kind of an intra-Catholic scapegoating. In other words, the ones who were carrying the blame were only the ones who ran the schools and not the whole church. So therefore, for example, the Conference of Catholic Bishops or other dioceses could say, well, we didn't have a school, this is not our concern. And that was more or less the attitude for a number of years. And I think that was a problem. I think that was a massive problem because it focused the blame simply on the groups who ran individual schools, the individuals and the groups that ran residential schools. And it protected or prevented the rest of the church from taking responsibility for this, together with those who actually ran the schools, because everybody shared similar attitudes towards Indigenous people. Similar attitudes with the government. So the decision that to focus the responsibility on the Catholic groups who ran residential schools, I'm being critical here, but I feel it was it allowed the rest of the church in Canada to avoid responsibility. Now, obviously and it hasn't worked. And I think that's now that the whole of the bishops of Canada have apologized, I think that's an implicit acknowledgement, one, that scapegoating, if you want to call it that scapegoating was not correct. And now the whole church in Canada is admitting responsibility, which I feel is the right thing to do. That was a little long, sorry about that.
The next question is two parts. Father Peter, do you think some of the Indigenous community's hearts recognize our martyrs in the fuller story? And part two, the Pope is considering a summer visit. Will you be ministering in relationship with the Indigenous community, and how will you be involved directly in the Pope's visit?
Let me start with the second one, then I'll ask you to repeat the first one.
Okay.
I think it's not clear yet exactly when the Pope is coming, but he did suggest in his talk on Friday that it would be around the Feast of St. Anne. So that's July 26th, I think. So unfortunately, at that time, the Jesuits in Canada have a province congregation, so I'll be involved in that. But that doesn't. But there's going to be tons of preparations going on between now and then, and the end of July is practically tomorrow for a visit like this. So I know the Guadalupe Circle, for example, I'm part of that, or the Jesuits are part of that, has already begun to prepare for a papal visit even before the Indigenous delegations went to Rome last week. Could you remind me the first part of the question, please?
Do you think some of the Indigenous community's hearts recognize our martyrs in the fuller story?
Well, I think many recognize the Jesuit martyrs as martyrs and saints. Especially the Indigenous Catholics. Fuller story. Yeah, I'm not in the fuller story. First of all, I don't know. I suspect so, but I don't know. You would have to ask them. But I suspect so, given the number of Indigenous people who go to the shrine, for example. I would suspect the answer to that is yes. But I would suspect that they would be happy for the fuller story to be told, and probably to have a role in developing that fuller story.
Any advice on what we might look forward to and how we might participate or collaborate and walk towards social justice in the truth and reconciliation process from here onwards?
Well, there are many, 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 many steps. The more compensation, more of the stories of survivors and their descendants need to come out. What it's all about in the end, I think, is right relations. The steps of getting to right relations are numerous and sometimes painful, but important. And the result, I think, is well worth the pain on the way. But in the end, it's about right relations. And we can start working on right relations right now. I mean, if you don't know Indigenous people, get to know some. Now, it's not going to happen overnight, but once you develop a relationship of trust, then you'll start to hear some of the experiences and some of the painful experiences too. So in the end, it's about building right relationships. Yes, concrete wrongs need to be named and need to be restitution or some kind of reparation needs to be done. But if we can't stop at the concrete wrongs that were done and the specific people who did them, it's important to deal with them. But we can't stop there. We have to go deeper to the underlying relationships and the power dynamic, the unequal power dynamics and attitudes that allowed, which were social attitudes, right? It's not just because, Sir John A. Macdonald saw Indigenous people as inferior that these things happened. John A. Macdonald had that idea because many, many, many other people had the same idea, and it enabled us to take the land from Indigenous people. But we have to go beyond those to the underlying attitudes and relationships and right those, so that in the end, as in some of the wampums, we move forward together in our own respective ways.
This is an easy one. Is the Jim Webb you mentioned the priest who worked in Jamaica years ago?
Yes, he is. Yeah.
What can the entirety of the church learn from the process of the spiritual exercises through the TRC as more and more people in the West become nons, N-O-N-E-S, and more Christian immigrants arrive to the West?
Well, what I've learned from the TRC, I've learned many things from the TRC, but I would say, I'll say more. So I would say the basic thing from the point of view of the spiritual exercises and Christian spirituality in general is that the Paschal mystery really works. It's true. But the way to resurrection, the path to resurrection, is through the crucifixion. And that can mean many things. But for us in the TRC, it means facing our truth. And once we face our truth, then new life begins, then resurrection begins. But as long as we try to evade, avoid, deny, or postpone our truth, then we postpone also our resurrection. That's one thing. Another thing I learned, and I think I said this in the talk here, another thing I learned from the TRC, and this took me some time to learn it, was their attitude towards us church folks. They never treated us like we were criminals. They had the right to treat us like we were criminals, but they never, ever did. Now that made it easier for us to face our dark side. And, you know, we wouldn't have been at the table if we weren't willing to face the dark side, but it wasn't, anyway, it was difficult. So their attitude made it easier for us to face our dark side. And in fact, they were looking at us as potential partners in reconciliation. Now, it took me a couple of years to recognize that attitude and to be grateful for it. So there's something that has to happen inside you about facing the truth in order to hear and recognize what's really going on. So it's like in the book of Isaiah in Scripture, the call of Isaiah. He has a vision of God, and it's terrifying, and he thinks he's going to die. And finally, an angel comes. He says, "I'm a person of unclean lips." An angel comes, puts a burning coal to his mouth, says, "Your sin is gone." And it was only then that Isaiah was able to hear that God had been saying all along, "Whom shall I send?" So it's been a similar thing with us. Once I had to go through a certain amount of transformation before I could recognize that the TRC were not treating us like criminals and were treating us like potential partners. And similarly, as we go through this transformation, I think we'll come to recognize much more readily the spiritual gifts of Indigenous people that we need. That we need, for example, to respect our common home, as Pope Francis is calling us to do, and climate science as well, and that we'll recognize that we should be allies in promoting spirituality and its benefits in the world, whether you're churched or not. But to really hear and to see, that takes transformation. I've learned that too.
This connects to the next question. After listening to your progress personally and as a community, would you say that reconciliation begins with me?
Yes.
Would you also say that one needs to accept reconciliation in one's own life?
Yes. But I'll add this. What I've been talking about here is really our own spiritual work. And it's work. This work and my transformation does not oblige the other side to forgive me. And maybe I'll never be forgiven by the person or the group that I have harmed and offended. But the call to me is to work on my own transformation. I ask for forgiveness, but I can't force it from the other person, right? And they're not obliged to forgive me either. Or it can take quite some time for them to come to a point of forgiveness, trust, and then forgiveness. But the point really is our own work on ourselves. So that's how I would answer and kind of make more precise my response to that question.
Really appreciate your presentation, honest and truthful. helping us all to understand. As CLC, Christian Life Community, we are learning so much through listening to Indigenous voices and spiritual conversation in our local, regional, and national communities, also through the US. Could you make a plug for this amazing work and guide as a help for us as Catholics to engage more in the TRC?
Oh, absolutely. So the Jesuit Forum, just give me a second. I'll get it off my bookshelf. I'm not going far. So, listening to Indigenous voices, a dialogue guide on justice and right relations, produced by the Jesuit Forum for Social Faith and Justice. It's a series of 11 sessions, really designed to be used in small groups. And almost all of the articles in it are written by Indigenous intellectuals. So it's a very helpful resource for pushing us along in the path of reconciliation.
Just a quick comment. I placed the link to the guide in both languages in the chat, so
Okay.
people can find it if they want to.
Okay, thank you. And I'll give a plug for the CLC too. The CLC have really helped the Jesuits in Canada develop spiritual conversation and discernment in common. So much so that we have an office for this now in our office in Toronto, where Patricia works. And Laurence Loubière, Sister Laurence Loubière, is in charge of that aspect of our ministry in Canada. I want to say another thing here too, that this makes your mention of the forum and the people who wrote in it. The Jesuit exposure to the TRC also exposed us to Indigenous intellectual life in Canada, which is quite rich and challenging. And I've since learned that it's many Indigenous intellectuals in other parts of the world really read with admiration what the Indigenous intellectuals in Canada are writing and saying. So the TRC kind of introduced us to this rich intellectual life and to what scholars are calling Indigenous Resurgence. So Indigenous people claiming their own rights to self-determination. But there's a rich intellectual life, Indigenous intellectual life in Canada, and we could do well to read any of the many authors who are writing now.
We have time for one more question. Father, what would the features of a decolonized papal visit look like for church structures, but also for Catholic faithful in the pews?
Huh. Okay, well, so I'll be really extemporaneous about this. So off the top of my head, I think it would have to be where Indigenous people were clearly the hosts of the papal visit. And that, yeah, clearly the hosts and the welcomers, and that the Pope would be coming as a spiritual leader on par with Indigenous spiritual leaders, and not as a head of state. The Canadian government will treat him as a head of state and all that, but that's not the point, I think, here. And for Catholics, or for Christians in Canada, this is a related thing now, not directly about the visit, but what would help make the visit more real and impactful would be for Christians in Canada to really start to understand and appreciate Indigenous spiritualities. Christian Indigenous spiritualities, as well as traditional Indigenous spiritualities. And as many Christians have experienced, to experience God and to experience Christ through Indigenous ceremonies and spiritualities. So I think that would go, that kind of specifically spiritual work, in addition to all of the other political and economic and social stuff, that kind of spiritual work, I think, would be part of the foundations for a papal visit that would have a long and fruitful impact. But the first thing that comes to mind is that Indigenous peoples are the hosts who are setting the agenda for the visit.
Thank you. Father Bisson, thank you for educating us on the important work you did with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and your ongoing work with reconciliation with the Indigenous people. We appreciate your honesty and your vulnerability in addressing some of these very sensitive parts of the history of the Jesuits of Canada. And we join you in your important tasks of reconciliation and supporting the Indigenous people of Canada. Thank you also to Jose and Fanny and our translators, Albert and Michelle, for helping us this evening. Our next session will start at 6 o'clock with Father Greg Kennedy, Return of the Prodigal Species, Spiritual Steps for Coming Back to Our Common Home. Jose?
Yeah, the only final reminder is, again, that the recordings for all of the sessions and the materials shared, including slides and handouts, will be shared via email with those who registered by 5 working days after the event. So watch out for that. And if you can, go into the auditorium section and rate this session after it ends. It really helps us optimize future events. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Pat.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thanks for joining.